I have a lot of hours in KSP, over 1,000 to be exact, which makes me a beginner at this game, but it's still quite a lot. In that time I've made countless rockets and aeroplanes, but I think in total I might have only made one functional spaceplane, which barely managed to orbit. I've also never managed a successful career mode playthrough, so after careful consideration, I've come to the only reasonable and realistic conclusion of how I could solve both of those problems. Now, countless people will have no doubt have done this exact challenge before, and I'm sure if I bothered to look before making this I'd find dozens of videos with this exact premise. There is one thing though that sets me apart from all of them. All of those other people are good at this game. I'm going to be doing this challenge with next to no idea how to actually build or fly a spaceplane, in career mode, in front of an audience of potentially several dozens of people. Firstly, we should lay out the rules for what exactly constitutes a plane for this challenge. Rule 1. Spacecraft must take off from a horizontal position with no external support. Rule 2. The wings must actively generate lift for the entire atmospheric part of the launch, which means we actually have to build a plane and can't just build a horizontally launched rocket. And Rule 3. All landings on land must be done in the same horizontal position as takeoff, so even if we're landing on another planet, we still have to land on the landing gear. After loading in, our first task, as with any career mode playthrough, is to get a Kerbal off the ground, which is actually where planes excel. Here, however, we encounter our first problem. We don't have any wings, or landing gear, or engines. What we do have, however, are stabilizer fins, extremely delicate scientific instruments, and the biggest firework ever made by Kerbal hands, and a test pilot with absolutely no regard for his own safety. And so, the Goldfinch was ready for its first attempt. Immediately after loading in this craft, we encountered the first issue: balance. Despite this, I decided to attempt the flight anyway and see if I could keep it in the air. I, of course, failed, as this plane has no way of controlling itself whatsoever. Thankfully though, our craft survived the crash and we gained some valuable science from it, enough to improve our equipment and make a slightly more successful aircraft. With the science, we can unlock liquid fuel tanks and a gimbal engine, which will give us the ability to control our aircraft in flight. With some general improvements made to the airframe, I gave powered flight another attempt. Sadly though, I quickly learned that no amount of engineering can make up for the pilot being an utter idiot. Back to the hangar. With our staging fixed, I gave controlled flight yet another attempt. Despite having no actual wheels, it managed to accelerate to 3/4 of the speed of sound on the runway and successfully got its nose up off the ground. With the experiments completed, I nosed the aircraft upwards as it approached the end of its fuel supplies and tried to squeeze as much altitude as I could out of it, as we would get a huge science bonus if we hit the upper atmosphere. Sadly, our fuel ran out and we were nowhere near the upper atmosphere, and so I had to bring it down for a landing. Even still, that mission netted us enough science to afford a pair of bigger wings, and after some creative experimenting, I settled on the upgraded version that would take us to the upper atmosphere, the Robin. We launched again in much the same way, and this time used a much more aggressive angle of attack thanks to our better manoeuvrability. This, however, failed miserably. So what exactly went wrong there? To put it very simply, for any given aircraft we imagine them as having a centre of mass and a centre of lift. Centre of mass is basically the point at which you can apply a force to an object and have it stay balanced. Centre of lift, on the other hand, is essentially the point where the force of lift pushes on the vehicle. So if it's behind the centre of mass, our vehicle will tilt forwards, and if it's in front, our vehicle will tilt backwards. The Robin had its centre of lift too far forwards, and as soon as our engine shut off, it naturally wanted to flip upwards and kill all of our speed. And so, having moved our wings even further back on the craft, the Robin was ready for its second attempt. This time, it nearly managed to hit Mach 3, and by the time the engines had cut out, the Robin was carrying way more vertical speed than it had last time. It shot through the atmosphere, and it comfortably managed to get the science we need. But now we have a much bigger problem: gravity, and a lot of it. The Robin will be re-entering the lower atmosphere with so much speed that our parachute would simply be torn straight off if we try to open it, and our craft still has no way of steering itself without an engine besides the tiny gyroscope sitting inside the cockpit. But since losing the craft would mean losing all the science we'd gathered, I had no other option but to spin up the gyroscopes and hope that we'd somehow be able to steer our entire craft out of a dive. And somehow, they did it. And after gently touching down the ocean, we recovered nearly 14 science, which combined with the science from the thermometer carrying Robin flight, allowed us to afford the most valuable technology of this run: actual wings, a small jet engine, and a set of purpose-built landing gear. This allowed us to build the first actual plane of this entire run, the Starling. However, straight off the runway I noticed a major drawback to this more traditional plane design. It's about as agile as your average Newcastle United fan, and doesn't have half the raw power. Still, it's the closest thing we've had so far to a functional plane, and the first vehicle in this run capable of landing, even if you slightly undershoot the runway. With an efficient, reusable plane, I was able to grind out a few contracts, which gives us the money to work towards our third task, getting to space. Unfortunately, our current technology isn't nearly enough to reach space yet, and so I'd have to grind out some high altitude contracts, which necessitated a high altitude Starling. This was by far the most challenging craft to design in the entire challenge, as despite getting past 56 kilometers being a laughably easy challenge in normal KSP, it's an absolute nightmare to try and do in an early game plane without autostrut. But eventually, after optimizing every millimeter of the aircraft, it managed it, and by a wide margin too. We actually managed to get within 6 kilometers of space itself, but this was the absolute limit of what we can do with this design. But now we have a craft that can reliably reach the upper atmosphere, and can farm as much high altitude science as we need to upgrade the Starling for spaceflight. Eventually, I managed to get enough science to afford a more stable airframe and a slightly more powerful engine, which will hopefully be enough to push us past the 70 kilometer mark and into space. Now we have a spacecraft with half a chance at actually reaching space, the Crow. The Crow's launch went exactly according to plan, and it actually managed to nearly double the Starling's height record. Now, some would argue that this doesn't exactly count as getting to space, since we only really flew through the very bottom of it for a few minutes before re-entering the atmosphere. Honestly, I would have to agree. I mean, could you ever imagine trying to claim such a thing? It then managed to not break apart on re-entry, and landed beautifully just off the coast of the next continent over. With the science, we're able to upgrade our craft with massively improved scientific equipment, and I even fixed the Starling's handling while I was at it. With the new supersonic Starling, we can grind more contracts and raise money for the next task, getting to orbit. For the sake of a new tourist contract, I also retrofitted the Crow to be able to carry passengers, and despite practically liquefying them on re-entry, it managed to take a group of tourists to space, on the first attempt, with no casualties. Let's just say there have been knighthoods given for less. Then came the Crow's final contract, to fly at an altitude of 18 kilometers above a set of highlands, fly through a marker positioned in the air above them, and record the temperature there. At first the launch went perfectly, and the Crow was on course to intercept the marked area. Then I noticed that the trajectory started shifting left and right randomly, and we were beginning to lose altitude. The Crow had fallen into a flat spin. This meant that our wings and control surfaces couldn't function, and we'd effectively lost control of the aircraft. I was left with only one idea of what to do, and so I waited for the spin to line up with the prograde marker, then fired the engine at full blast. This was thankfully enough to stop the spin, but we were now out of fuel and way off course of the marker. Thankfully, the Crow's luck hadn't run out yet, and mere seconds before we dropped below the 18 kilometer limit, the marker came within range and we managed to lock the temperature. But now, we were stuck miles inland from the nearest ocean, in a plane that can only land on water. So Jeb had to ditch the Crow, and our 12,000 ton space plane went hurtling into the dirt. In one last stroke of luck, however, the onboard command module in the passenger compartment survived the crash unscathed, and so we recovered the temperature logs we needed. While we did lose our only functional spacecraft, the mission gave us the last of the 225,000 funds we needed to upgrade the hangar, allowing us to build a much larger orbital vehicle. Weighing in at 38 metric tons and generating over 600 kilonewtons of thrust, we have the first orbital spacecraft of the entire run, the Jackdaw. Now, those of you still watching will probably be thinking, that name makes no sense at all. Western Jackdaws are on average 200 to 400 grams smaller than carrying Crows, so why is the larger space plane called the Jackdaw? And I honestly have no good answer to that. Anyway, the Jackdaw was now complete and ready for its first launch, in which I quickly learned the tail design isn't the best for horizontal stability. After buzzing the tower for extra style points, Jeb got the nose oriented 45 degrees above the horizon to the east. My plan was to hold a steeper angle of attack until we got through the thickest parts of the atmosphere, then nose down horizontally to accelerate to orbital velocity. This would hopefully prevent the Jackdaw from breaking apart from having to travel at orbital velocity while still inside the atmosphere, which is a necessary step in its flight plan. As you can see, I nosed down way too early in the ascent, which you can tell by the fact that our plane is no longer visible through the superheated plasma. Having mostly survived the ascent, we could now coast our way out of the atmosphere, then begin our orbital insertion burn to get us the rest of the way to orbital velocity. After doing a few laps of the planet to prove that we were in a stable orbit, I could now prepare for re-entry into the atmosphere. This would have to be done over water, of course, as our fixed landing gear didn't quite survive the ascent. The re-entry went without issue, besides maybe stalling a little bit too hard towards the end, but I recovered it and managed a gentle landing on the water. Now, after 5 grueling hours, we finally accomplished the first 20 minutes of any normal campaign. Now we can set out towards the first proper goal of a normal career mode campaign, landing on Minmus. I'm afraid though that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and good night.